What's up? It's Dr. Taylor. And one of the things before I get into this, I'm going to do a study review, but in our practice, in our building, I should say, I have my functional medicine practice where I see people, live and also virtually, all over the place. And then we also do neurofeedback, which is EEG neurofeedback, which is super cool and involved in OCD, which is what we're going to talk about today. But then we also have Alicia, who's a counselor in our office, and she specializes in OCD. So that's kind of even how her and I, became friends and began working together too, is like her saying hey, it's not all brain, and me saying it's not all body, and both of us being like, oh my gosh, it's both. And the autoimmune, component to this, but also the value of her specialty with exposure therapy and other things OCD wise. But today I'm going to share a study about OCD and autoimmunity. Now, I think that this is getting to be more well known in the PANDAS world, which is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric disease associated with strep. So it's like strep induced dopamine autoimmunity, and you get OCD, or you can get tics or things like that. Now, today's video is not exactly about pandas. Alicia and I are making an online program about pandas together where we educate on these things. But today's video is specifically reviewing a study about OCD. And so let me just jump right into it. This is from Current Psychiatry Reports in 2019, OCD, autoimmunity, and neuroinflammation. Now, I'm going to go as quickly as I can, quite frankly, just to not waste time or be too boring. But I think that the point is some of these things, and I've highlighted a lot of these things, but I'll just point out some of these, like the summary. This review highlights that OCD is associated with low-grade inflammation, neural antibodies, and neuroinflammatory and autoimmune disorders. In some subsets of OCD patients, autoimmunity is likely triggered by specific bacterial, viral, or parasitic agents with overlapping epitopes in CNS, meaning there's cross-reactivity between something like strep and a dopamine receptor, but it's saying it's absolutely present in a lot of these cases. So I think this is interesting. So here goes into the stats. Again, I highlighted some things just so I stay on track, so I don't just read the whole paper to you. But there's growing evidence for the implication of dysfunctional immune system involving both innate and adaptive immunity arms in the pathogenesis of a significant subset of OCD patients. Indeed, an excess of autoimmune comorbidities has been found in OCD, meaning a lot of people that present with OCD also have Hashimoto's, also have rheumatoid arthritis, or whatever the case is. Furthermore, involvement central autoantibodies may explain a subset of OCD in children. That's the antibodies against dopamine receptors, and with strep, and that's what it says here, notably group A hemolytic strep antibodies that cross-react with certain epitopes on the neurons in the basal ganglia, which is an area deep in the brain, but that dopaminergic neurons seem to lead to either pediatric autoimmune, that's what it is, not acute onset, is it? Pediatric autoimmune, you wouldn't think that I would forget that. The PANS is the other one, the sister one, pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. PANDAS is associated with strep infections, but there's growing evidence about those things. So my guess is that somebody that's watching this video might be a parent of somebody with OCD, or might be a parent that's suspecting PANDAS, or it might be an adult with OCD tendencies. And I think that one of the interesting things about OCD that Alicia, can touch on more is that sometimes it can get worse and it can get better, and it kind of goes into flares and remissions, and people can say things like, oh, my OCD is acting up, or my OCD is a lot better now, which to me says there's some kind of, inflammatory or autoimmune, variable to it. Inflammation, so it says overproduction of prostaglandins and nitric oxide, common consequence of inflammatory processes, is known to be responsible in tissue damages and with brain things like neuroinflammatory. Interestingly, balanced neuroinflammatory processes are not necessarily evil. I don't know why I highlighted this. But it said, hence it would be expected that disruption of this balance by these inflammatory processes could contribute to a range of neural and behavioral abnormalities, including OCD. And I think the point of that too is that like inflammation is associated with most brain conditions, now, whether it be Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, or depression, anxiety, OCD, there's an inflammatory component with a lot of those processes. The persistent low-grade inflammation observed in OCD alone cannot explain the complex pathway of its pathogenesis, but pre-existing susceptibility in combination with timely encounters of environmental triggers, which could include toxins or other things too, seems to be necessary. And then it goes into all these studies of autoimmunity in OCD. Family studies suggest that mothers of OCD people have elevated rates of autoimmune diseases. 20% of the mothers of PANDAS children had at least one autoimmune condition. Here's some of them down here, some of the studies. And yeah, then it talks about autoantibodies that can be measured, like in PANDAS. In response to group A strep, autoantibodies may cross-react in the basal ganglia and the motor cortex. That's why people get tics, where the basal ganglia is more the OCD, or you can get anxiety. The basal ganglia has to shut down the amygdala, which is the fear-sensing area, or there's dopaminergic neurons in these areas. Interestingly, pandas with small choreiform piano-playing movements of the fingers and toes share antibodies against dopamine receptors with Sydenham chorea. So anyway, these things are fascinating to me, but the fact that chronic tics OCD is associated with anti-neuronal antibodies against dopamine 1 receptor and lysoganglioside, together with the activation of this calcium modulin kinase, suggests that at least in a subset of PANS, or pediatric neuropsychiatric disorders, autoimmunity against brain structures possibly leads to dopamine transmission alterations. That's the most important sentence there. Autoimmunity against brain structures leads to dopamine neurotransmission alterations. More recently, dysregulation of glutamate, a ubiquitous excitatory neurotransmitter, was shown to contribute to OCD. Glutamate is the opposite of GABA. Glutamate is neuroexcitatory. Things like molds and head traumas will increase glutamate. Tons of things will increase glutamate. It's also the G in MSG. So sometimes kids get hyperactive after they have MSG or food dyes or things like that. But there's glutamate dysregulation, let's just say. Other studies found that brain autoantibodies detected against basal ganglia and the thalamus in OCD patients were elevated compared to controls. Basal ganglia antibodies are nearly 5 times more likely to be detected against patients with OCD. So there's just, again, all these studies that I'm just cherry picking some of the highlights from, but I think the point is that there's an association. Yeah, piano playing, these are more the elevated anti-dopamine 2 receptors as opposed to dopamine 1 receptors. So it goes into, again, these details. Other antibodies have been found in OCD, such as anti-Purkinje antibodies. That's the cerebellum. The cerebellum, the base of the skull back here, gates all of your senses. It's on a balance and coordination and things like that as well. Strep and OCD, the microbial hypothesis. These are hypotheses. It's not every single person with OCD, but I do think that if you are somebody that suffers with OCD or your kids have OCD, it's a little more mainstream now, the fact that strep can be involved with this in the context of PANDAS. It's pretty trendy right now, I would say, in the autoimmune wellness world. Positive subjects for strep are more likely to have OCD and tics as compared to people that don't have strep. So there's just an association. This is another interesting. Oh, they're talking about other infections, Toxoplasma gondii, which is here they are, Mycoplasma pneumonia. That's an important one. Different viruses can be drivers of neuroinflammation. Maybe not with OCD, but like even HSV and different Epstein-Barr virus drive neuroinflammation. EBV is associated with MS. HSV is associated with Alzheimer's, but they're talking about viruses here. Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite infecting 1/3 of the world population. So it's like, uh-oh. But that's another one that's associated with some brain things. And this said, patients that are positive for Toxoplasma have nearly 2.5 times higher risk of having been previously diagnosed with OCD. Toxoplasma is most famous in like cats and litter boxes. But it's a really common parasite. It infects the brain and can drive some of these things similarly to strep, but maybe in a different way. But it says of interest is that Toxoplasma gondii directly increases the dopamine release in the brain. And it is known that increased levels of dopamine play a role in OCD. So yeah, it goes on to treatment with antimicrobials, non-specific treatment against inflammation. Low-grade inflammation may accompany OCD early in life. The binding of cytokines to the vascular endothelium generates this inflammation. Attempts to reduce the inflammatory burden in OCD may represent an attractive therapeutic option. Now, in this study, they're talking about NSAIDs and corticosteroids like prednisone and things like that. But in the wellness world, it's things like luteolin and curcumin and resveratrol and PEA and fish oil, DHA, are things that just can reduce the inflammatory burden, could potentially be helpful. Again, the study's not saying that, that's my words, but same concept. Here says NAC, N-acetylcysteine, the precursor for glutathione. NAC has been proposed as a potential therapy as it may regulate the exchange of glutamate, and it has anti-inflammatory properties. So there just haven't been that many studies on these other things that I mentioned, but it's absolutely theoretically plausible. And conclusions, in summary, the literature review suggests that OCD is associated with low-grade inflammation, which is, again, basically my specialty, and comorbid neuroinflammatory and autoimmune disorders, as well as with neural antibodies, especially autoantibodies directed against basal ganglia and dopaminergic receptors, DR1 and DR2 receptors, and thereby modulate excitatory neurotransmission in the context of not PANS or PANDAS, or the context or not of PANDAS or PANS. In some cases of OCD, autoimmune may be triggered by infectious agents, such as strep, other bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Moreover, even if the time frame of their occurrence is yet to be known, the observation of infectious triggers, low-grade inflammation, and autoimmunity strongly suggests a gene-environment interaction pathway comparable to that of other psychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, or autism. A major goal in OCD setting is now to dissect each part of the immune response, including immunogenetic susceptibility, inflammatory, and autoimmune background beyond cellular phenotype analysis. So that's where something like testing the gut or testing for food sensitivities, or testing for toxins is just evaluating the inflammatory burden or evaluating the immunotyping or some of those things, just measuring inflammatory cytokines and things like that, but putting some numbers to things so we test and we don't guess. But I think that that's where a functional medicine setting comes in for anything related to OCD and autoimmunity. So that's pretty cool to me, but it's also cool when we see great success with it. So yeah.